Thank you, and good afternoon, and thanks for being here. I'm going to talk about India, and what's in a title, what's in a flag. And when you look at this flag, the top is saffron, and saffron is power, and it is considered red gold in India. It's actually one of the most expensive commodities per weight on the planet, more expensive and more valuable than platinum. And then you have the white, which is purity and honesty and truth, and then the green, which is about verdance and ability to grow. And if you look at the mandala in the center, it's basically the Dharma mandala, which has 24 spokes, and each of those touch on a value of wisdom, knowledge, and kind of the universal truths of humanity. And so their flag is symbolic of their purpose as a nation. And between China, the West, and global South, India is always in between. And you'll notice that we see India as a nation that is not fully aligned with a lot of different nations, that it has this non-alignment value in their governance. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that and its history and advent. But first, I'm going to talk about really briefly the Foreign Policy Association that founded in 1918. The Great Decisions started in Portland, Oregon. The very first Great Decisions meeting group and policy discussion group started in Portland, Oregon in 1954, my vintage. So it's kind of a nice thing. But these are the other topics we're going to be addressing in the spring. And you'll see that we've changed one. We had originally planned to talk about Oregon civics education standards with Representative Paul Evans. He won't be available in April for that presentation, so we're moving it to the first week in the fall. So, Great Decisions, these are the fall topics, and it includes that civics presentation. And this is the guidebook that we study from. There are three opportunities to participate in Great Decisions discussion groups. One is the League of Women's Voters, the other is with the Greeters Association, and then here at Willamette University. Another opportunity for alignment where international policy is discussed and weighed in on at the UN level is the United Nations Association, of which we have a chapter here in Oregon. And we can talk to Anita or myself if you're interested in pursuing participation in the United Nations Association. It's a sounding board for the United Nations. It's a local feedback loop, if you will. So with that, these are the Great Decisions group of Willamette University meets the first and third Thursdays for lunch in Gowdy Hall. We prepare these presentations, we assign some to different members, and we talk about other issues such as international peace treaties and sovereignty discussions when the nation topic isn't in the room, and that kind of thing. So here it is, in between China, the West, and the global South. So here's India. How many people knew about that yellow portion way to the right? How many people thought of India as that? Well, that's a recent addition in Upper Burmese Heights, Myanmar, and Upper Bangladesh, and has been acquired by India since 2008. That's new, and as well as the lobe on the very top of India has been acquired in part, and they have boundaries, and it's changing, and as a nation, we are not as aware of that growth. India has got the second largest standing army in the world, and they are very proficient, and so we'll go on from there. But there's a lot of characteristics about India that we don't know. And so I'm going to give you context for the video that we're going to watch later. but the population is 1.4 billion. You can see that they have a $14 trillion, and that's a parity, price purchasing parity number based on US dollars. But the GDP per capita is 2,485. So if you take the gross sales of the nation and divide it by the number of people, you get $2,485. For contrast, in the United States, it's 85,000. And if you look at the European Union, it's in the 80,000. In the Scandinavian countries, it's over $97,000 of gross domestic product per capita. So that gives you some context. And there's a lot of different things that have changed over time. $20 billion in US military imports since 2015. Since the previous Republican administration, that number is now $20 billion a year. So there's a significant enhancement in India's militarization, or modernization, if you will, of their military. So there's numbers here. You'll see there's only 41% of the population participate in labor, but they only have a 7% unemployment rate. And the US does that too. And these are numbers from the World Bank. And so a lot of people are way underemployed. They have means of income. They have no means of standard of living that's anything that we're familiar with. So the employment rate is 38%, and then $2.15. So that's like a third of our nation would make $2.15 a day. That's to give you context for the population. The average age is 29. In the United States, the average age is 38. So there's a lot of differential and a lot of different needs that this government has to meet with their younger population. And so one of the things that the Great Decisions Group has talked about is, well, our international political policy is changing right now. And so we ask, how does it change? And this is a kind of a history of our US aid to India, non-military aid. And it doesn't appear to be a lot. You see the $151 million. And when you keep in mind that the US government budget is $6 trillion a year, $6.7 trillion a year, I did the equivalent math, and that's like somebody making $150,000 loaning you $1,200. So, and India is the most populous nation on the planet now. It's eclipsed China. In 2010, they projected that India would pass China by 2030. It has already eclipsed China's population. And ironically, when I looked at, well, this USAID has already been cut off. And so you look at that history and, so they are missing 100 million. Well, so what, right? It's a small budget. It's not a big number, but one of the things that was in here was a surveillance program for antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis. It was ironic that we just heard that, but that we were doing field work to gather and understand the expanse and the amount of trade. And it's important because in 2000, there were fewer than 1 million people who identified themselves as Indian Americans. It's now 4 million. So in 20 years, it's quadrupled as far as a percent of our population. Those are people that may or may not have, some risk here. And so when you look, you'll always hear numbers like, $2.6 billion in humanitarian aid. And they'll say, we're going to cut this $2.6 billion. Well, that's since 2001. That's over 23 years. And so you'll hear, so the political element of the information that we get, and you'll hear time and again that even the current administration will say we're cutting $2 billion of aid to India. Well, it's over that. It's this 100 million this year. So it's important to look at the scope and context when we look at the international population or spending. So here are some of the geophysical or geographic characteristics. One is the Bengal tiger national animal. There's 3,500 alive today. In the 1930s, it was estimated that there was over 100,000. So the British imperial rule in India was from the 1858 through 1947. And in that period of time, a huge amount of resource acquisition occurred. And then as well, there were, Bengal tigers were a trophy. And that was, began the whole trophy hunting feature, and they decimated their national animal. Now, it's reported that it is in ascension, that there in 2001 there were a number of Nature Conservancy and other environmental organizations that began to support that, but the population had still been decimated. But it has 4,600 miles of coastline. That's about equivalent to the continental United States, so, and not Alaska. And there's the national bird is a peacock. Chess was invented there, and it was invented, and the game was documented in almost exact movements and players. They weren't castles and rooks and bishops, but and that was 1000 BC. So they are an intellectual population. They have a lot of sophistication. The national tree is the banyan tree, and it is the tree that has the largest root system per its size and shape. And so it is a symbol of that stalwart, that part of that verdant green part of their flag. So Hinduism is the major religion, 80% of the population. Christians are about 14%. And although the most famous banyan tree in the nation was where Buddha held all of his discussions in India, it's revered. Less than 1% of the population are Buddhists. So the cow is considered sacred by the Hindu religion, so a majority of the population are vegetarian as a result of that. So what is it? What do they have? How do they, address the needs of that large a populace? And well, they are, they produce 319 million metric tons. It's the fourth largest. China produces 1,000 metric tons. The US produces about 500 or 600 metric tons. And so that gives you some idea of the scale of their food production. So they do import a significant portion of their foods. The mangoes, the national produce, they actually grow 40% of the global mango crop. And they're big producers of spices. The saffron shows up, pulses, legumes. How many people here eat hummus? And well, hummus accounts for half of all the complemental vegetable protein consumed by humans on the planet. Half. And chickpeas. And they are the largest producer. So you see these zones I showed you where they had branched out into Bangladesh, where they branched out into Myanmar, and they've had a war in the past with Pakistan, their neighbor. And you wonder, well, what are they going to war? They have war. They are at war right now in two disputed territories with China. And what do you notice about this picture? These are the disputed territories. Well, they have 1.4 billion people, and the Himalayas produce the water for a third of the population of the planet. And they are doing war over high elevation ice fields. And because China is in fact on the north side of the Tibetan Plateau and over towards the Cambodian highlands, diverting water to their nation from southern flowing terraria. So the average elevation of the Himalayas is about 18,000 feet. Yeah, and it's a larger area than the continental United States. So, and here's another closer look, and you can see those hash mark areas. Those are disputed territories, and they have boundaries or borders in India are not called a border. They're called line of actual control, is what they call them. And there were people just in the past year. If you recall, I gave a presentation on international diplomacy, and we talked about the wars, the tens of thousands of people that die every year to skirmishes. Well, thousands have been dying in Pakistan and China and India over the last 5 years.
Mark, where's the hatched?
The hatched marks are these darker sections here of the lower Himalayas, up there in Pakistan and here. So anyway, when we look at Indian history, it's one of the longest standing organized forms of governance on the planet, right next to China. 3000 BC in the Indus population was the first time they had found agrarian communities doing governance. They had documented evidence of interpersonal standards of practice and governance. And if you look up there at the top right, that little red hash mark, that's ever since the Republic of India was founded in 1949. In 1949 was when the British declined to continue their imperial rule. It was at the end of the World War II, and there was a lot of conciliatory demands made by India to get them on their own governance footing. They are a democracy, and they have lasted since 1947. So here's some political history characteristics. They had full independence again in 47. They are a country that is committed to non-alignment. They are not without fault. During the 70s and 80s, many of you will remember, they had a very authoritarian rule. In fact, they almost abolished their constitution, and it was challenged on a number of fronts, very much like what we're experiencing today. But you'll see that Modi, the prime minister now, he's a Hindu nationalist, and he has a lot in common with our current president. But there is still parliamentary rule. So there is hope. I just want to paint that picture for us and for India out into the future. But there's a history of warfare. And the only time that India really lost their footing was with China in 1962. And at that point, they joined forces with the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was producing a significant amount of weaponry and exported it for an affordable price. And they borrowed everything but the influence. They borrowed their technology, they borrowed their certain aspects of agrarianism. They had tractors, and you go to India, almost every truck and tractor that's more than 15 years old is made in Russia, not China, because they have been at adversarial boundary concerns with China for their entire existence. So I mentioned their military size and they're now the world's largest arms producer, something of note. And They are a founding member of BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then these southern nations. And so you'll see they just recently joined a European corridor membership, and which has caused a great deal of controversy. And you'll hear more and more in the next several years about Quad 4. And it is Japan, Australia, US, and Qatar. So, interesting package, but it's about producing and strengthening a trade corridor to Europe, which is a large, close proximity market. So, ironically, the political favor of India with the United States has shifted from time to time. And you'll see here that George Bush initiated the Quad 4, and the Trump administration bolstered that Quad 4 partnership. And and during the Barack Obama administration, you'll recall there was a number of issues about human rights. India has not been completely above board on reporting human rights abuses. They have a lot of secular characteristics to their human rights abuse. The Sikh population is often elbowed aside, and if you recall, even assassinated in Canada. The Sikh leaders were. So you'll see that there was a lot of discord on human rights issues with the United States during democratic administrations. The same applied with Bill Clinton. There was a lot of women's rights issues, and all the way to mutilation and honor killing, and it was honored, if you will, God forbid. And so Bush initiated a lot of trade. It was focused specifically on picking up where Russia left off. It was a trade that was specific to the arms environment, and establishing a bulwark of an ally in that region of the world where we could kind of launch and protect our interests in the Middle East. So with that, I'm going to transition to the video, and the video is from the Foreign Policy Association. They have videos on each of the 8 topics that they choose. They publish this document in January. It has 8 very current issues. The DVD we're about to see is about the history as well as some of the current political climate and issues of contention and issues of agreement. So with that, we'll start with the video.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Great Decisions Masterclass. We reached the midway point in the 8 lecture series today by looking at India, a fascinating case study in South Asia. While it is an ancient civilization, the modern state of India is now only 77 years old, born shortly after the end of the Second World War. It has the world's largest population, and that makes it the largest democracy in the world. India is a nuclear weapons country, and to many an emerging great power of the 21st century. Its regional context in South Asia is one where India dominates the former areas that were the British colonial empire. Neighboring it, however, are major powers, including China, the Russian Federation to the north, and off to the northwest, the European powers. This means India will always struggle globally to have that identity as a great power. More locally, India struggles. Pakistan is to the north and west, a country that rivals it on the subcontinent. It is a country in Pakistan that India has been at war with on numerous occasions, and the two remain deadlocked over the territorial dispute in Kashmir. Just on the other side of Pakistan, of course, is Afghanistan. Historically, India has been an ally of Afghanistan, regardless of who is in power in Kabul. In some Western circles, there was alarm at how quickly New Delhi established a cordial relationship with the Taliban when it came back to power in 2021. We now turn to the geopolitics of India and its neighbors. It's a fascinating tale. It evolved in ways that many would find surprising. During the Cold War era and to this day, India and Pakistan remain locked in a very bitter rivalry for preeminence in the region. The Chinese aligned with Pakistan, which is not surprising given that India and China are two counterbalancing powers in the broader perspective. One might anticipate that the United States would join India as democracies and the Soviet Union would join China as fellow communist powers. But that is not what happened. Rather, the Soviets aligned with India and the United States sided with Pakistan and China. This is an indication that form of government and ideology are less relevant in strategic decision-making than calculations based upon power.
India and the U.S. regarded one another with suspicion throughout the Cold War.
After independence, we lined up quite strongly behind India. President Truman and President Eisenhower were actually quite enthused, not sure which way India would go. Would it be aligned with the West? Would it be aligned with a growing Soviet power, or would it take its own course?
We have an interest in a stable, growing subcontinent. And therefore, when we discuss aid with India, it is not in the context of India asking us for a special favor, but of defining joint objectives.
President Nixon became enamored of Pakistan when he visited Pakistan as vice president way back in 1953. He went to India and asked the Indians to join America against the Soviets, and the Indians said, why should we? We want to be non-aligned. President Nixon interpreted that as India wanting to be neutral. India said, no, it's not neutrality. Non-alignment means we will get from the Soviets what we need, and we will get from you what we need.
As the post-Cold War era emerged, the most notable factor is the dissolution of the Soviet Union, transforming itself into 15 independent countries, with the rump state of Russia being the dominant one remaining. However, in the 1990s, Moscow largely was sidelined in many of the calculations. In the 1990s, India and Pakistan went nuclear, joining the unofficial nuclear club. These are two countries that are not considered legitimate nuclear powers. Those five are designated in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, yet neither of them signed the NPT, which means they, like Israel, have the legal right to possess nuclear weapons, as they've not signed that right away. As we look at the 1990s and beyond, the US, India, and China were clearly the dominant actors in the region. We sought to continue our relationship with Pakistan, which from time to time we find to be very, very important, at other times not so much. We reached out to China in hopes that increased trade, membership in the World Trade Organization, and better relations now that communist on an international level was gone would allow the US and China to have better relations. But we also sought India as a very logical partner in the region. Our relationship with China frayed over time, and our patience with Pakistan grew thin, leaving us with a primary focus on India as our major ally in Asia. What reflects this pivot is the Quad Alliance, which connects the United States, Australia, India, and Japan in a soft defense alliance. As we look at this geographically, and by the way, this was a recent great decisions with the Foreign Policy Association, it's pretty obvious the target of this alliance, the People's Republic of China, an effort to, in effect, isolate them geostrategically. What do we think of India today? Is it a great power in world politics? It would need a number of different factors, including a sizable geography, significant population, an economy of size, military capability, including force projection, a track record of winning armed conflicts, continental, if not international interest, and a reputation among the other great powers that it belongs in the club. If these are the 8 tests for Great Power Club entry, India is halfway there. It has 4 of them without question. The other 4, it probably does not pass the test. India finds itself in what I call the Great Race. It doesn't involve military affairs or even international relations, but rather the great race between population trends and economic well-being. We'll measure that in per capita income. So here we have any country, population is growing, per capita income is increasing. At some point, you would anticipate that income reaches the level of population, but the question is, does it surpass the threshold of being a wealthy nation? For the United States, we passed that threshold with ease, long before our population leveled off and only grew slightly thereafter. If we consider China, it lost that race. It never reached a respectable per capita income before its population not only leveled off, but began to decline. So how about India? If it's here on this graph, will the economics allow it to cross that boundary before the population declines? That's the big question. It's almost impossible to tell at this point. In some ways, India is a thoroughly impressive economy. By aggregate, it's the world's 5th largest economy. But by per capita income, 140th out of roughly 200 economies in the world. Factors in favor of India winning the great race: the population is still young, a median age of 29, the same as Indonesia. The United States and China have median ages of 39. It's an enormous difference. And the economy of India is modernizing very, very quickly. This gives us some optimism that it could eventually win the great race. On the negative side, the bureaucracy is overwhelming and stifling, and the social and political divisions run very deep in India. So where exactly do we put the Republic of India on the spectrum of powers, from minor to great power? It certainly has aspects of a great power, but there are also Indian behaviors and attributes that look more like a minor power. But the vast majority of India, as we look at it today, falls in that regional power range. It has made efforts to elevate its global status, being a founding member of BRIC, which later became BRICS with the addition of South Africa. India is showing that it can play with the big powers of the world. But as we look at these 5, you've got Russia and China on one side, India, South Africa, and Brazil on the other, meaning they really act more like regional powers than truly global ones. Another effort by India to enhance its international standing is the India-Middle East-Europe corridor. It is a trade route with a great deal of infrastructure connecting to allow India and Europe to trade freely and fairly. In so doing, India hopes to improve its economic standing. The global hierarchy today, well, we've got the big 3 at the top. I would place the European Union, a collection of France, the UK, and Germany, given that UK is out of the EU. That's a secondary concern. And then finally, countries like India, Brazil, and South Africa in the 3rd tier. I draw the great power line between the US and the EU. Others might include the European Union as great power members, but almost everyone agrees that India is not yet in the club, and certainly is well more impressive and influential than the minor powers in the system. Its path to great power status, it would first of all have to resolve the Kashmir dispute. You really can't be a great power if you can't settle a territorial dispute with a country next to you that is clearly subordinate in power. It needs to stand up for global rules, become the voice of the lesser developed countries of the world, mainly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and then finally find a way to convince the others, the Americans, Russians, China, maybe the Europeans, that it deserves to be considered a great power. We'll briefly look at each one of these challenges. Kashmir. I consider this to be a non-justiciable dispute because it's largely driven by emotion, by politics, even issues of ethnicity and religion, uncontrollable local militant actors. These are insurgents, freedom fighters, many call them terrorists, that really determine what happens on the ground so much more than what is dictated from the capital. Non-justiciable means that law and diplomacy will not resolve it. The vast majority of disputes in the world are justiciable. Countries can sit down, they can articulate their interest, find some sort of middle ground, and reach an accord. I don't view Kashmir as one that can be resolved this way. And that's why it has festered for 3/4 of a century, and that's why it will very likely fester for the remainder of the 21st century. Kashmir will always be a thorn in the side of India. It is a territory that is both Indian and Pakistani. The British didn't know what to do with it after World War II. They decided to let the locals decide, and over time both Pakistan and India made claim to it. China is a tertiary power on the issue of Kashmir. It won a significant portion in its war against India in 1962 and was gifted another portion by Pakistan. But the main populated areas, and certainly the industrial and population centers, are what are known here as the northern areas and Jammu and Kashmir, the green and the gold. A number of low-level conflicts have occurred here, a couple of hot wars between India and Pakistan as well, and from time to time things get really serious when Pakistani irregulars enter into Kashmir, provide support for local forces who then go to the Indian side of Kashmir or even into India itself to commit acts of violence. That is when India and Pakistan get very close to another armed conflict. This is what we call a low-intensity conflict, and as noted earlier, there seems to be no end to it. Standing up for global rules is a very important part of being a great power. India should be a strong supporter of the rules. And it's not that it's a major violator of international laws. It clearly has human rights issues. It has not joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and its position on the Ukraine war has puzzled many. India is a country you would think would stand up for issues like sovereign integrity, that one nation should not invade another and take its territory, what we call territorial aggrandizement. But it appears that New Delhi has instead taken a very weak position on the invasion because it prioritizes access to cheap Russian oil over international principles. This does not play well in Washington, Paris, London, or Berlin. Becoming the voice of the lesser developed countries. In the old days, we talked a lot about the so-called Third World. The first world was the United States and its allies. The second world was the Soviet Union and its allies. And then all of Asia, Africa, and Latin America were called the Third World. We don't use those terms any longer. They're considered derogative. Instead, we talk about the developed world, the developing world, and the underdeveloped world. Bandung was a conference in the 1950s that India was a major player in, which said that all of these other countries don't need to align with the Americans or the Russians. We should not be pawns in the global Cold War struggle. Instead, we should unify as a non-aligned bloc. In essence, it was an alliance against the prevailing alliances. It didn't really work out that way, as both the Americans and Russians reached deep into all of these regions and proclaimed victory each time one of them sided with Washington or Moscow. But India was there, and what it argued is, we are the natural leader of the third world. We're the natural leader of the lesser developed countries. The challenge that India faces is in the form of China, which was not one of the Cold War poles or superpowers as it began to emerge as a recognized nation state when it took its seat in the United Nations General Assembly away from the island of Taiwan. China claimed that it was the true representative of the emerging world, of the lesser developed countries, or as we said at the time, the third world nations. Here you can see them. They run across from left to right, from South America and the Caribbean to Africa and into Asia. They are diverse economically, politically, strategically, and in almost any other fashion. They number well above 100, and they're very difficult to corral into a single voting bloc in places like the United Nations. But this is something that India takes seriously, and it wants to demonstrate that it, not China, is the true leader of these countries. Those two are in an epic diplomatic battle over the hearts and minds, the loyalties, and the alliances of countries in green, and to date China has won that struggle overwhelmingly. And then finally, should it figure out the first three challenges in its path to great power status, India would need to convince the others that it deserves recognition. One of the ways it could do so is by gaining a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. The Security Council is a powerful organ in the United Nations, at least on paper. Looking at chapters 6 and 7, there's very little that the UN Security Council cannot do. Its real weakness is in the deep political divides between Washington, Moscow, and since the Cold War ended, Beijing. Each of those three, plus France and the United Kingdom, have permanent seats on the Council and veto power over all resolutions. The remaining 10 seats are rotating. Countries occupy them for 2 years before rotating off, and they do not have veto power. So for India to be on the Council, it needs to be selected as one of 2 countries, technically 2.5, because Asia and Africa share an additional seat. It needs to be selected to one of those rotating seats in order to serve 2 years. India desperately wants a permanent seat, but so does South Africa, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. So there's a lot of competition. But the biggest obstacle would be amending the UN Charter, which happens very rarely, and given divides, is highly unlikely to happen moving forward. So the idea of a permanent seat with or without veto power probably not going to come to fruition. Another way that India can show it's a player in world politics is by demonstrating that in a constructive role in conflicts. We have an ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. The United States and the European Union are clearly on the Ukrainian side. So it's not as if we can be a neutral third party or an arbiter to negotiate between the two principles. Countries like Austria and Switzerland, historically neutral, countries that could host a conference between Moscow and Kiev, no, they've sided with the Western powers, with Ukraine, and against Russia. China, it favors Russia. Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, they've largely barred themselves off from this conflict, playing both sides, if you will, in search of favors. The United Nations, not a chance. The Security Council is too deeply divided. So it really leaves only India, if there is to be a hosted conference, a negotiated settlement of this conflict, India could play that role. It has not lost the favor of Moscow, and especially recently has demonstrated that it would stand up for Ukrainian sovereign integrity. Our policy options for India. How should we handle this fascinating country, and one that clearly has been a target of the United States now for 25 years? Really, since the emergence of George W. Bush, India is the preferred partner geostrategically in Asia. One option is to narrow our focus. Rather than trying to solve a multitude of issues that we have with India, why not focus on a core issue of security concern, the Kashmir crisis? Kashmir could be resolved if both sides made major concessions, but doing so very likely leads to local actors causing conflict to spill over. So this probably isn't the best option in the world, but you do hear people making this argument. We could press India more strongly on its nuclear arms. We've basically rolled over to India and Pakistan for that matter. When they went nuclear in the late 1990s, we applied sanctions, but the Bush administration largely dropped them for voluntary reporting by India and Pakistan. So this would require a reversal of a few decades of American policy. We could attempt to pull India away from Russia, to pressure it, to cajole it, or to entice it to cut ties with Moscow, not formally but informally, to begin criticizing Russia for the war in Ukraine, and decide not to resist the international sanctions being applied to Russian oil. Again, this is dicey because the Indians are very proud, they want their own position in the world, and they definitely do not want to be pushed around by any major power. Or we could look beyond the contentious issues. These big three could take a sidestep, and we could look at issues that are more mundane, yet equally important, relating to trade, social relations, and affairs inside and between the two countries. No doubt, a very important diet in world politics. I would not put it on the level of US-China, US-Russia, US-EU, or US-Israel, but India is probably in the top 5 of countries in the world that the United States needs solid relations with, can depend upon, and would like to work with moving forward. We both speak the same language. India has enormous amounts of skilled, inexpensive labor, and then there's the beauty of the time zone. Because in the 1990s, that Trans-Pacific underwater internet system, the cables were installed by the United States, economically connecting the US to India. And what this means is that if American businesses especially would like to outsource their work, whether it's tax preparation or anything else, well, when we finish our business day, we send it off to India, they're just going to be starting their business day. And that means these two can work 24 hours a day in terms of American outsourcing of some expensive labor. Much has been made of the election of Donald J. Trump in 2024, inaugurated in January of this year, and certainly this has implications for India. Having said that, we probably should remember that his opponent in the 2024 race was of Indian descent, but nonetheless, on a geostrategic level, Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi got along very well during the first Trump administration. They're both strong men. They both press an America or India first approach. They tend to be more domestic oriented than international. And the two seem to see eye to eye on many major challenges, including boxing in China and resisting its massive export of inexpensive goods to the rest of the world. I would expect that U.S. policy towards India remains cordial. We continue to work this country, to lure this country, to elevate the status of the Quad Alliance, as Mr. Trump did. He resuscitated it after a decade in which it was largely dormant. So we're looking at a positive relationship moving forward, probably very little change in terms of Kashmir, probably India's position on Russia, and in terms of many of the economic challenges, the obstacles we face to having truly free and fair trade with the country. As always, I thank you for attending the lecture and encourage you to stay engaged and make great decisions.
So as we transition back to the slideshow where I'll bring up the questions, I just wanted to point out that, on the Kashmiri element of the dispute with Pakistan and China, it's still quite active. And they talked about, well, the nations may resolve it, but there may still be dispute in that area. And part of it is in context to the cultural aspects of the nation, India has 1,600 different languages and dialects. They have 21 languages that are nationally recognized as official. To contrast that, in the United States, we have 170 indigenous and English languages and dialects, and only one national language. And so they have a lot of variability in tribal disputes that in some cases are multi-generational in that Kashmiri region. And then when you look at just the other aspects of the trade routes, and they're partnering with UAE and Qatar in that European corridor, those are not necessarily countries we are always completely aligned with on human rights issues. So there is a lot of ongoing tension there. So again, we have to look to the history. History always kind of leads the way in to the future, and these are the 6 driving assumptions of U.S. international policy up until November. And so there's a lot that are possible, but we don't want our alliances to hinder our personal goals. That's always been there. It's sometimes more amplified in other administrations. And then, so those are and then we do want a world order that favors trade. So, and then I want to bring this back up because people took note of it the last time I showed it. This was a survey done recently by the Pew Trust. It's statistically quite valid. The population was big. They segmented it by geographic, by political party, by income, by gender. It was well designed. But one thing you notice here is these are the questions to the lay Americans, right? And you'll notice India, the second most populous nation in the world and the 4th largest economy, doesn't show up at all. It's not in America's consciousness and forefront as a key international issue. So again, I'm going to invite you to join us for lunch over in Gowdy Hall. The group deliberates and talks about, and we review these presentations for the upcoming meetings, and then we can move to the questions. And so I'm going to just let us soak in these inquiries. These are the questions from the Foreign Policy Association that some 1,200 great decisions groups around the world respond to them. In the spring, we'll provide responses, and they take that and it forms their response to other organizations that show interest in this level of sampling, if you will, of public interest. So thank you, and then we'll go on to the. So any questions or any responses to some of these? We've just got a few minutes, but we can. And here's one here and one there.
As usual. One thing that wasn't mentioned in the presentation was as India and its large population wants to have a standard of living equivalent to the rest of the world, that's going to require a massive amount of resources, the resources of 2 or 3 planets.
Yes.
And when we talk about resource depletion, India could do it. Mm-hmm. India could deplete the global resources before they ever get to anything like this.
Yes.
So that's something that wasn't really brought up.
All of the Foreign Policy Association climate issues that we've looked at over the years have looked at what do we do if people want to all own a house on a half an acre in a suburban with all of the underpinnings, the cruise holiday a year and so forth that we have, and it's a calamity and without an accelerated address of climate change through renewable resources, they're not going to be able to do that without cloying air quality issues in their own communities. Right now, Mumbai and some of those cities have some of the worst air quality in the world. Their internal combustion engine use and age of that equipment, as well as coal. They use a great deal of coal for power. They also import a significant portion of Russia's oil, and Russia is one of the largest producers. So it's that too is one of the things that the Great Decisions Group has pointed out about the Foreign Policy Association's approach, is that it may not, those 4 issues that they point out, there may be that 5th, the elephant in the room, and it's not addressed.
We don't have time for any more questions.
Oh.
But I have one that I'm going to ask him afterwards. So please thank Mark for his presentation.
Great, thanks. Thank you. Good. Yeah.